So we're going to talk about specifically bacteria and virus and a little bit about their background. This is supposed to be a story of coevolution, talking about how humans interact with diseases, showing a different case study on evolution. So first off, just a couple reminders about what bacteria are. Bacteria are prokaryotes, meaning that they don't have a nucleus or membrane-bound structures. So no mitochondria, no chloroplasts. They're in terms quote-unquote simple, and we can sort those into two categories: eubacteria and archaeobacteria. Bacteria are kind of the ones that you find commonly in your houses. Archaeobacteria refer to kind of ancient bacteria. These are the ones that live kind of at the bottom of the ocean in volcanoes, very hard to live places. Looking at these bacteria, these two kingdoms, you can kind of identify them by shape and how they're grouped. So if we look at a bacteria, what are some of the typical structures we see? We see things like pili, the cytoplasm. They mostly still have DNA and a plasma membrane. They can use things like the pili and the bacterial flagellum to get around. And what's important for us in terms of diseases is the capsule and the cell wall. So depending on what the capsule and the cell wall are made of, are determine how you want to get rid of this bacteria. So if they're gram-positive or gram-negative, that affects whether or not what type of antibiotic to use to get rid of this bacteria. So if you have strep throat or MRSA, that the component of the bacteria determines how you're going to kill it. So how do bacteria reproduce? Bacteria reproduce asexually, meaning they don't need a mate. They do something called binary fission, bi meaning two, where they duplicate, and that creates kind of two from one. So they literally just bud off. And this is really different from humans because they can reproduce really quickly, oftentimes between 20 to 30 minutes. So where do bacteria kind of get their genetic diversity? It's really interesting. They get it from kind of new plasmids. So even though they don't mate, they can give each other circular DNA called plasmids, and that can lead to antibiotic resistance. So these plasmids kind of create variety as well as mutations. So if you get a mutation in your DNA, that will lead to changes, as well as these new plasmids. And you kind of think of like power-ups, where each plasmid can act as a way to be resistant against a certain antibiotic or grow faster or be able to metabolize a different sugar. So the plasmids or circular DNA kind of act as power-ups that different bacteria can pick up from each other. So most of the time when people think of bacteria, they think of them as really bad. But in terms of this lecture, I do want to remind you that bacteria can be useful, that they can carry out photosynthesis, that as producers, they break down a lot of things. So without decomposers, when we learn about ecology, this is huge because if we don't have bacteria, there'd just be dead stuff everywhere. And they're extremely useful in industry, genetic engineering, for digestion. If any of you guys have ever eaten like Activia or yogurt, it's all advertised under the idea that bacteria can help you take care of digestion, and it's really useful in terms of genetic engineering for making insulin and some GMO products. So what are viruses? Viruses, in contrast to bacteria, are non-living. They are either DNA or RNA, and they live inside a case. So on the right, you'll see a couple different types of casing that viruses can live in. Viruses are non-living, and what they do is they basically destroy cells using them as copying machines. So they're basically the lazy thing. They cannot replicate using their own enzymes. They don't have any machinery. They need to use a different cell, and they're really dangerous because they can cause cells to explode and hijack cells. They're basically terrorists. They can't do anything. They need someone else to do everything for them. So what are diseases? We know that diseases can be caused by bacteria and viruses, which are their problems. And that's known as a pathogen, something that causes diseases. And those include things like bacteria and virus. So what are some of the ways that bacteria can cause disease? They can damage the cells and tissues by breaking down the cell for food. So this tends to be one of the most common ones, where they're just inhabiting your body and they're causing problems. The other one that's really bad is they release toxins. And this tends to be what happens when you get like diarrhea, dysentery. Those are ones that release toxins. If any of you guys know Botox, so models use Botox. That's actually a toxin that comes from bacteria that causes freezing of the muscles. So bacterial diseases you might have heard of are tetanus, bacterial meningitis, strep throat, and a staph infection. So what are these things? In the upper left-hand corner, the tonic and clonic phase, you'll see that's tetanus, that's extreme muscle problems. In the bottom middle, you'll see kind of a staph infection. So those are things to worry about. And in the upper right-hand corner, when you go to college, they usually worry about meningitis. So that's when your meninges, or the covering around your brain, becomes swollen, and when that becomes swollen, you can imagine that causes problems because your brain swells up. There's no room for it to go because of your skull, and that's something we really worry about because increased pressure in our head is never a good sign. So that can be caused by bacteria as well, and it's really common in college students because they don't know how to take care of each other. They don't recognize the difference in their illness. So here's a couple of other different bacterial infections. You might have gotten an ear infection, a sinus infection, eye infections from running your eyes, pink eye, sexually transmitted diseases or infections are all examples of bacterial infections. Viruses, on the other hand, are quite different. Like I said, they are non-living. They are things like flu, herpes, rabies, measles, rubella, and recently Ebola. So what can you do to get rid of these things, and how does evolution come into play? Humans can affect evolution of these things by using vaccines. So vaccines are weakened or killed pathogens that don't cause problems. They don't cause autism. That study's been thrown out years ago. And the idea is the vaccine creates immunity. So your body, it forces your body to adapt, and it kind of gives you traits that you wouldn't normally have. So we're kind of going proto-Gattaca here. The idea is by taking a vaccine, you're not able to, you're already exposed to it. So your body recognizes it evil. It can use antibodies to help you out. So antibiotics are only used for bacteria. And so when you talk about antibiotic infection, it's an antibiotic resistance. It's when antibiotics no longer affect a bacteria. The bacteria have evolved to resist that, and that's a problem. Viruses do not respond to antibiotics. Antibiotics, anti meaning against, biotic meaning life. So when you have an antibiotic, it means it does not respond. It only kills living things. So it's a problem when people use antibiotics for colds because there's no way it'll work. Those antibiotics are exposed to bacteria. It leads to evolution of these things. It's problematic. So the big issue with this is medicine and evolution. In terms of antibiotics, it's created an arms race. We're trying to make weapons to get rid of these things, and bacteria and viruses can mutate quicker and reproduce quicker. So excessive use of antibiotics, whether it's in food, you might read about cows, it can create a lot of problems because what we used to use to kill stuff is not killing things, and it leads to dangers such as like antibiotic-resistant MRSA, which can be a huge problem. So how does this affect you in terms of 3 things that can affect you? When you go to the doctor, don't ask for antibiotics for a virus. It won't do anything, and you're actually leading to the problem. If you take antibiotics, make sure you take it all the way to the end, because if you don't take it all the way to the end, your first dose of antibiotics is going to kill off the weak bacteria, and you're only going to leave the strong bacteria, and it's going to be harder and harder to kill that strong bacteria. In terms of food, try to eat things that don't have antibiotics in the food. So, for example, cows, chickens, milk, a lot of food that we eat, when it was being born, they just give it antibiotics. It's not even sick, but they'll give it to it. And the other thing we got to worry about is super diseases and vaccines. So, for example, antibiotic MRSA, if you get it, you can't treat it with the old regimen. You can't give the same medicines you used to because it's antibiotic resistant. And you also have to worry about things like measles and Disneyland. So that might be something you'll read about. But the idea is that we need to protect everyone by getting as many people vaccinated as possible because we can help with that. So in conclusion, what you need to worry about is vaccines help everyone, whether it's a virus or a bacteria. Bacteria can be treated, viruses cannot. Keep that in mind when you go to the doctor. And keep in mind how this is all related to evolution. Bacteria and viruses are evolving. We're trying our best to keep them from evolving or slow it down. And the best way we can do that is try to limit the changes to the environment and limit the exposure that we have to antibiotics. So that wraps up this lecture for this week, looking at a case study of diseases, bacteria and virus and evolution, and the little arms race between us and bacteria. So if you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email. There's also some other cool links that really talk about this issue, which is a key issue that you need to think about as the future citizen of this world. It's something that's really important because what you choose to do affects everyone. So hope you have a great day. Take care. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email or call. Take care.